Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the circle was red, the study was scarlet, and the Scot was glorious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about the giant rat of Sumatra, the remarkable worm unknown to science, or the repulsive story of the red leech?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 346. Why didn't I check Montague Street? Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Or should I say I'm Scott Montague?
Scott Montague. Scott Montague. Now, if there are two Scott Montagues, because you're the second Scott Montague, then where's the first one? Is this a case of superposition? One
He's on
being,
Montague Street.
On
Simple.
Montague Street.
I left him on Montague Street.
Of course.
Yes. Well, this is one of our Master's Class episodes where we look at a piece of exemplary Sherlockian scholarship. And this quarter, we are looking at some of the works of Michael Harrison. And we delve into the archives of the Baker Street Journal for this one, from volume 20, number 4, which would have been in the fall of 1970.
December 1970.
December of 1970, even better.
Yeah. In those days, Julian had the month. You know, he did March, June, September, and December issues of the journal.
That's dangerous.
Very specific.
Because it commits you to a publication schedule, much like our little podcast here coming out every Wednesday. We will continue with the discussion of exactly what Michael Harrison was talking about, Montague Street. Of course, we've heard of that with respect to Sherlock Holmes's early presence in London. But what does it mean? Where did he go? Where could we find it? We'll explore all of that momentarily. Just a reminder, the show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/trifles346. That's all lowercase. It'll take you to our SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website. And you can click on links there that we have, and you can sign up for email updates. You can also sign up to be a Patreon supporter. And we do have news with respect to Patreon. Patreon and Spotify have recently integrated. So now our Patreon supporters can listen to our shows ad-free on Spotify. So that's a wonderful integration that we'll have going there. And that is what Patreon support gets you, is ad-free shows, as well as thank you gifts and rewards at different levels. So check that out at patreon.com/trifles or at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Well, we crack open the yellow hinges of the Baker Street Journal for our master's class once again, and we find ourselves, as I said, in volume 20, number 4. Michael Harrison took a crack at exploring Montague Street. And Bert, I take it you've been to London before, right?
Yes, I lived in London briefly for about 6-7 months and worked there quite a bit. And in fact, I'm ready to go back. Goodbye.
Yeah, it's a wonderful city. Well, as Samuel Johnson said, when a man tires of London, he tires of life. still very much the same there.
Do you know, when I tired of life, I just got Newsweek. Now I bet you wish I had muted myself.
Yeah, please.
I want to tell you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Mike. Interestingly enough, Michael opens this piece saying there is, at least in England, an old expression: "I could have kicked myself." Evidently, he hadn't heard "I could have kicked Bert."
Oh dear, oh dear.
But he said, it occurred to me that for all the man-years of research that I put into my Sherlockian investigations for articles, broadcasts, and books, I never turned up Montague Street in the London directory. Wow.
Yeah.
But Montague Street has a very specific location, does it not?
Oh, it does. And here, right at the start, you've started at a great point in the essay, which is the first sentence. We've talked about Michael Harrison in the past, Maurice Desmond Rohan, whose pen name, but he simply became Michael Harrison, born in 1907. And in this essay, you get his insights into culture and practice, things that only he really could bring to the table back in 1969 when this was written. And here he shows you, exactly what can be done, because as you say, he starts by saying, I could have kicked myself because for all the man-years of research that I put into investigating Sherlock Holmes, I never turned up Montague Street in the London directory. And so here's Michael back in the late 1960s, in the pre-internet age, going to libraries and records offices and opening up books, the post office, London directory. Off he goes to the library. And to your point, Montague Street is one of the early references Sherlock Holmes gives to Watson about his experience, saying that when he came down to London, he took rooms in Montague Street.
Well, perfect. And that is... there's a hint there. Michael says, well, why rooms? And he turns to William S. Baring-Gould's Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street. And he said, this would have been 1877 when Holmes took rooms on Montague Street, just around the corner from the British Museum. But why rooms? For when I, Michael writes, turned up Montague Street in the Post Office London directory for 1881, I found, and then he lists the various numbers and the residents at each number. And when we come to number 24, there is a certain Mrs. Holmes living at 24 Montague Street. Well, that's interesting. Is this a relative? Is it a landlady that just happens to be named the same as our Sherlock? Is it a wife? Who could it be?
Yeah, a sister-in-law. Is it possible that this was his mother, says Michael, and that she had run a boarding house? He says, I thought, heaven forgive me, that the master had told Watson that he'd taken rooms because he'd hated to confide in a bourgeois Watson that the proud Sherlock had lived in a family-run lodging house. And so Michael is just getting started here. So he's been to the library, looked at the London directory. And of course, just to remind our listeners, the reason why we turn to these essays is because these are great examples of playing the game. And if you want to explain to someone what playing the game is all about, it's very simple. You can just do it in a few words. It's Sherlock Holmes was a real person. And so here we are back in the 1880s, Michael at the library looking up directories. He says, mystery on mystery. I turned up Mrs. Holmes herself. I found her personal entry not under the commercial and trade directory, but under court directory, which, though it had little connection with the court of Queen Victoria, still meant that the names listed under its heading had no too obvious connection with trade. And there was the entry, Mrs. Holmes, 24 Montague Street, WC. It was patent that Mrs. Holmes did not run a boarding house and that young Mr. Sherlock Holmes had not, at least in the colloquial British use of the phrase, taken rooms there.
24 Montague Street, WC. It was a water closet? Goodness, I hope not. Well, Michael says the accuracy of any directory's entry depends, of course, on the accuracy of the information submitted, but there's no reason why, when difficulties present themselves, we should always assume that the directory and or informant are wrong. Now, let me explain. He says, in English usage, one calls, say, the wife of Mr. Robert Jones, Mrs. Robert Jones. But when the husband is head of his branch of the family, the Christian name is dropped. Correctly, my wife should be addressed not as Mrs. Michael Harrison, but as Mrs. Harrison. Does then the entry Mrs. Holmes indicate that Mrs. Holmes was the wife of the head of a particular branch of the Holmes family? Was she the widow of Holmes's father? She could not have been the wife of Holmes, since he had a brother older than himself. Now, that sentence is intriguing to me, Bert. She could not have been the wife of Holmes, meaning Sherlock, since he had a brother older than himself. Why would that be the case?
Well, that's what he's referring to in his prior sentences. He's saying that the custom, and this is one of the lovely things you get from somebody like Michael, and this is what he's really bringing to the table, this sense of customs and culture and practice. What he's said to us is, one calls the wife of someone in this time, in the 1880s, Mrs. Robert Jones, unless Mr. Robert Jones is the head of the family, in which case she would simply become Mrs. Jones. So, presuming Holmes's father is dead, Mycroft, being the older brother, would be the head of the family.
I see.
And therefore, Mycroft, should he marry, would be, his wife would be Mrs. Holmes, and another such person who was not Mycroft's wife would simply be, Mrs. So-and-so Holmes.
Well, that makes sense then. That makes sense.
Yeah, but this is, for all of my reading in this obscure Victorian stuff, I've never really thought about or come across that particular distinction. So here he is, he's put on the page. And then he says, you also have to understand that even Victorian directories are not always meticulously correct, and that the information upon which the directory compilers act is not always derived from the well-bred names that appear in their pages. A servant may well have answered the directory's representative. "Who lives here, eh? Oh, it's Mrs. Holmes." And now Michael has, rather than me imposing this on you, Michael has put in the little Cockney italics here, and as plain Mrs. Holmes, the entry would have appeared. So he says, maybe they got the wrong info from a servant too.
Maybe they spelled it wrong.
Well,
maybe it was Mrs. Holmes.
Mrs.
OHMS.
Yes, a husband being a prominent electrical experimenter.
Yeah, it's an electrifying household. Well, Michael says, according to William Baring-Gould, young Mr. Sherlock Holmes came down in the spring of 1877. And one impressive confirmation of the fact that he intended to come to London, studying all those branches of science which might make me more efficient, as Holmes wrote, is to be found in the directory for 1876, which records that number 24 Montague Street passes out of the possession of Mrs. Charles Nugent into that of Mrs. Holmes. It seems clear that Mrs. Holmes took the house in Montague Street so that Sherlock, son, nephew, brother-in-law, might have a residence convenient to the British Museum. And, though no one yet seems to have realized this, University College Hospital in nearby Gower Street. How about that? And for those who are familiar with Sherlock Holmes through the BBC series, Gower Street stood in for Baker Street, for the filming of 221B Baker Street. And if you actually go to North Gower Street in London, you can see Speedy's Sandwich Shop right next to the fictitious 221B Baker Street. Learn something new every day.
Yes, yes. The taking by Mrs. Holmes of 24 Montague Street was connected with Sherlock's decision to come to London. And it seems to be proven, says Michael, by the dates of her residence, the local rate books. So now here's Michael digging away. You know, we've been to the post office, we've been to the trade directory, now he's into the rate books. The local rate books record she took over number 24 in the Michaelmas quarter of 1875. Now, the semesters, what in America we would call the semesters of the colleges, are aligned in England, particularly in the 19th century, with these various periods. I mean, without getting into too much detail, periods on the calendar, and this is the Michaelmas quarter. So a year after Sherlock entered, supposedly, Caius College of Cambridge, according to Baron Gould, Michael refers, and gave up the tenancy. Then Mrs. Holmes gave up the tenancy in the Lady Day quarter. So it starts in the Michaelmas quarter of 1875, and she gives up the tenancy in the Lady Day quarter of 1883, having been granted permission by the Duke of Bedford's estate to extend her 7-year lease by 6 months. And the 1883 directory shows 3 houses vacant in the street, so that the superior landlords can have made no objection to Mrs. Holmes overstaying her lease.
Oh, well, and we should pause to note here that we did an episode, gosh, it was called Quarter Day is at Hand.
Right.
And this would have been, way back in season, gosh.
Quick, into the TARDIS.
I'm looking. Here it is. It's episode 13 in season 1.
Grief.
That is way back. We're all right at the beginning, where we talked about what these particular quarters meant. So something to bookmark. We've got a link to that in the show notes. And while we are pausing here to interrupt our narrative, let's also pause for a quick message from our sponsor. When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. Okay, we're back. And where were we before we were so rudely interrupted?
Well, we were in the fantasy world of Mrs. Holmes's tenancy in Montague Street. Her tenancy was due to expire in 1882, 7 years from 1875. And it was at that point that Holmes exerted himself to get rooms elsewhere, because as we know, says Michael, young Stamford introduced him to Watson, and he found rooms in Baker Street in January of 1881. And
perfect timing,
perhaps it was for Mycroft's convenience that Mrs. Holmes was asking the Duke of Bedford to let her stay in number 24 Montague Street until the beginning of 1883.
Yes. Well, when it comes to the neighborhood, and we know that Holmes makes great study of his surroundings. Michael says when a young man is just down from university, with or without having taken his degree, Montague Street at the Great Russell Street corner, of which lies the British Museum, must have had a singular appeal. Almost all of Mrs. Holmes's neighbors were respectable professional people. Of 30 tenants, 5 were architects, 1 was a sculptor. There were to be 3 sculptors living in Montague Street before Holmes took rooms in Baker Street. 3 were medical doctors, 1 a surveyor, 1 a solicitor. And there was Mr. William Noel West, Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and actuary of the Bloomsbury Savings Bank. Number 2 Montague Street was in the tenancy of Captain Moss de Vries. So again, here Michael has done his homework extraordinarily well, not only looking at who the tenant and landlady was at number 24, but looking at all the surroundings and seeing what he can infer as a result.
Yeah, and I just can't reinforce enough. This is the age, 1969, no internet, no searching. Michael has a pencil and a legal pad, and he's going from dusty desk to dusty desk, researching one point, leading to another. By the time that Mrs. Holmes' 7-year lease was about to expire, the incoming tenant was Mr. William Page. There were many changes in Montague Street. It seems to have been a street of respectable but very transient tenancies. In 1883, in the last time that Mrs. Holmes' name appears in the London directories, Captain de Vries has become Lieutenant Colonel de Vries. Mrs. Crawshay has been succeeded at number 1 by Abram Israel, Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, a noted scientist of the day. 3 different sculptors, 3 different medical practitioners have come to live there. One of them was named Mr. Charles Alexander Innes, who took over number 21 from Mr. William Bone. So Mr. William Bone has left number 21, and in comes a medical doctor, which certainly seems like nominative determinism. And he says, you will recall, of course, that the name of the literary agent's younger brother was Innes.
Yeah. How do you like that? And interestingly enough, Innes was also my great-grandmother's maiden name.
I didn't know you were related to Conan Doyle.
Yes, now you do.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's a grand old name.
Yeah.
And then,
and then Michael asks, well, why the Holborn? Right? Because recall that Watson met up with Stamford at the Holborn Bar. Oh, that was the Criterion Bar.
Criterion Bar.
Right. The High Holborn Road was...
no, he takes him to lunch. He takes Stamford to lunch
That's
at the
Holborn. That's right. And he says...
Watson, who has very little money, takes him to the Holborn, which is a big deal.
He says, before we leave Montague Street, there's one important name we must notice. You'll remember that after having met Stamford at the Criterion Bar, which the Criterion in 2023 does not exist as it did in Michael's day. I think the location is still there, but it's not the Criterion anymore. Watson, in the exuberance of my joy, asked his former dresser to take lunch at the Holborn. But why the Holborn? Here we could have easily dismissed it out of Watson's drunken stupor, but Michael says, my recent discoveries enabled me to answer that question. The Holborn restaurant was at the corner of High Holborn and Little Queen Street, now Kingsway, and the High Holborn entrance of the Holborn restaurant was immediately opposite Southampton Street, now Southampton Place. Bloomsbury Square, and Montague Street, of course, leads just short of a few yards out of Bloomsbury Square. And why did Watson ask young Stamford to lunch at the Holborn when there was an excellent lunch at 2 shillings at the Criterion itself? Simple. The directory supplies the answer. On the door of number 6 Southampton Street was a big, shining brass plate bearing this inscription: John Watson, M.D.
So there is Michael finding that on Southampton Street in these days, there was a John Watson, M.D., and he says, young Mr. Sherlock Holmes can hardly have failed to see Dr. Watson's plate as he passed down Southampton Street. Though young Stamford was needed to introduce them, Holmes and Watson must often have stood shoulder to shoulder at the pink marble top of the Holborn's famous Long Bar.
Well, and there it is, that wonderful tying up of the loose ends where Michael makes sense of it all for us. He looks into all of these facts, lays them out, and comes up with a completely believable narrative in playing this wonderful game.
Yes.
A true master's class in Sherlockian scholarship.
Indeed, indeed. And it shows you, the fun you can have by playing this game. It shows you what inferences you can draw from where things are and what it's possible to overlook. I mean, remember the beginning where Michael said, boy, after all these years, I never thought of looking at Montague Street. And it shows you, what yet can be done. And it shows you what fun you can have doing this.
And that is anything but a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
It is a hobby of mine to have an exact knowledge of London now. There is Mortimer's, the tobacconist.
The little newspaper shop. Coburg branch, the City and Suburban Bank.
McFarlane's carriage building depot. And the vegetarian restaurant around the corner. Watson, commit to memory. It is just possible that we're being observed.